Integration is a basic law of life. When we resist it, disintegration is the natural result. That quote really sets the stage for what we're talking about today.
It really does. It gets to the heart of why integrability is such a crucial quality attribute in architecture.
Welcome back, everyone. So today we're doing a deep dive, really getting into the details of Chapter 7 from Software Architecture in Practice. It's all about integrability.
That's right. And it might sound simple, just getting software pieces to work together.
Yeah, plug and play, right.
Well, not quite. Architecturally, it's way more involved than just matching function calls.
Okay, so what's the formal take then? The textbook definition.
The core idea is this. Interoperability isn't just about making things cooperate now. It's really about managing the costs and the technical risks down the line.
Costs and risks, like what specifically?
Think about schedule blowouts, performance suddenly tanking, or finding out your technologies just won't mesh properly. All those things that pop up during future integration tasks, maybe ones you didn't even anticipate.
Ah, so it's about planning for future pain, basically. If you haven't thought about it, integration becomes a real problem later on.
Exactly. It becomes a liability instead of just a task.
Okay, let's try to unpack this a bit. So the abstract problem is we've got our system, let's call it S, we control S.
Right. Our system.
But then we need to integrate some new thing, C.
Mhm.
And this C, maybe it's off-the-shelf software or from another team, another vendor entirely.
And that's the kicker. That external source means you often have gaps in what you know about C, its assumptions, its internals.
Which creates complexity and risk. Lots of risk.
Definitely. The book uses a great analogy, the travel power plug one.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Good one.
So your component C is like your North American plug. Your system S is the North American wall socket.
Plug it in, works perfectly.
Yep. Trivial integration. Zero cost, zero risk, basically. They share the same assumptions.
But then you take that same plug, your C, on a trip, say, to the UK.
Right. And immediately you hit a problem. The pins are different. The shape doesn't match the socket.
That's a physical mismatch you can see.
Exactly. That's syntactic distance. It's usually obvious. And the fix, an adapter, it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, so I buy the adapter, problem solved, syntactic distance bridged. We're integrated now, yeah.
Not so fast. You plug in your 110-volt North American device using the adapter.
Into the UK's 220-volt socket. Uh-oh.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The type of thing is the same electricity, but the value, the meaning of that electricity, 110 versus 220 volts, is totally different. That's data semantic distance.
And fixing that needs more than a simple adapter. You need a voltage converter. Much trickier.
Much trickier. And it highlights that distance isn't just one thing. It has layers.
And the analogy went further, right?
Yeah.
With frequency.
Yeah. Even if you get the voltage right, maybe your device expects 60 hertz cycles, but the UK system provides, say, 70 hertz.
So the plug fits, the voltage is okay, but the timing is wrong.
Right. The component might just fail or behave erratically because its internal timing assumptions are violated by the system S.
Okay, so that frequency difference, that's another kind of distance.
It represents other dimensions we need to capture, like temporal distance. The point is, integration gets difficult, costly, and risky because you have to bridge these different kinds of distance at every single point where S and Psi interact.
Got it. So integrability isn't just about matching APIs. It's defined by how hard it is, how much distance there is to bridge.
Which leads us nicely into the metrics. How do we actually measure this difficulty?
Right, how do we quantify it?
Well, the book says integration difficulty, the cost and risk, is basically a function of two things: size and distance.
Okay, size and distance. What's size?
Size is sort of the quantity aspect. It's the sheer number of potential dependencies, the number of connection points you have to worry about between the new component Psi and your existing system S.
More connections, more potential problems. Makes sense. And distance.
Distance is the qualitative part. For each of those dependencies, how hard is it actually going to be to resolve the differences? How big is the gap?
And the book stresses that dependency isn't just A calls B, right? Things a compiler can check.
Exactly. That's syntactic dependency. And it's important, but it's not the whole story. You could have dependencies related to timing or resource usage or subtle differences in meeting semantic coupling that code analysis tools just won't find.
You can't just rely on static checks then.
Nope. You have to actively look for those hidden assumptions, the knowledge gaps. Which brings us to the 5 specific dimensions of distance that architects need to consider.
The 5 dimensions. Okay, let's break those down. These help us characterize all the relevant dependencies, not just the API signatures.
Dimension 1, syntactic distance, is the most straightforward, like we saw with the plug shape. Disagreement on the number, order, or type of data elements, expecting an integer, getting a float, expecting 3 parameters, getting 2.
Easy to spot, relatively easy to fix, usually.
Generally, yes, which contrasts sharply with number 2, data semantic distance.
Like the voltage example.
Precisely. The types might match, they're both numbers, maybe both integers, but the meaning is different. Altitude sent is 1,000, but does that mean 1,000 meters or 1,000 feet?
Ooh, that
Yeah.
sounds dangerous. Easy to miss in testing.
Very dangerous. These errors often slip through. You become heavily reliant on really good metadata, clear documentation, or shared understanding. Big source of risk.
Okay, third dimension.
Behavioral semantic distance. This gets into disagreements about states, modes, or the sequence of operations. It's not just what the data means, but when or how it's interpreted based on context.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Maybe a component interprets an input command differently depending on whether it's in startup mode versus normal operation mode. Or maybe component A assumes it initiates communication, while component B assumes it waits to be contacted. That's a behavioral mismatch.
Right, different assumptions about who's in control or how things sequence.
Exactly. And that often ties into the fourth dimension, temporal distance.
The timing issues, like the frequency example.
Yep. Disagreements about timing assumptions. This one is subtle but critical. Like one component produces data at 10 hertz, but the consumer needs it at 60 hertz. Or maybe component A must respond to component B within 50 milliseconds.
Ah, so latency requirements are part of this too.
Absolutely. If an update to A pushes its response time to 51 milliseconds, the integration might just silently fail under certain conditions. That latency expectations is part of the interface, even if it's not written in the code signature.
Okay, subtle and important. What's the fifth one?
Fifth is resource distance. This is all about competition for shared system resources.
Like memory, CPU, network bandwidth.
Exactly. Does component A need exclusive access to a log file, while B assumes it can share it? Or the example from the text? You have 3 components, each trying to push 3 megabits per second onto a network channel that can only handle 5 megabits total.
Yeah, things are going to break down. Resource contention.
Right. Unless you explicitly manage that resource distance, the integration will fail due to resource exhaustion or conflict.
So syntactic, data semantic, behavioral semantic, temporal, and resource distance. Managing those 5 is key to planning for integrability.
It really is. It's like a focused way of planning for modifiability by making potential differences explicit so you can actually manage them.
Okay, so how do we structure that planning? The book introduces the general scenario for integrability, like a template.
Exactly. It's a blueprint, a way to formalize how you think about future integration tasks and their desired outcomes. You can't really solve the problem effectively until you define the goal clearly.
So what goes into this scenario?
It forces you to specify key things. First, the source of the integration stimulus. Is this requirement coming from an internal stakeholder, maybe the component marketplace, or a specific vendor pushing an update?
Okay, where's the change coming from? Then what?
Then the stimulus itself. What kind of integration are we talking about? Are we adding a brand new component? Are we integrating a new version of an existing one? Or maybe connecting 2 existing components in a totally new way?
Defines the what. Makes sense. And critically, how do we measure success?
That's the response measure. This is crucial. You don't just say it needs to integrate. You quantify it. What's the acceptable cost in person months, maybe calendar time, or budget?
So concrete limits.
Yes. And also, what are the acceptable effects on other quality attributes? Can performance degrade by, say, 2%? Is a slight increase in memory usage okay?
Ah, so it forces you to define the trade-offs.
Precisely. It leads to a concrete, testable requirement, like the example given. A new data filtering component from the component marketplace is integrated into the system and deployed within 1 month, using no more than 1 person-month of effort.
That's specific. It names the source, marketplace, the stimulus, integrate new component, and the response measure, time and effort constraints.
Exactly. A clear target.
Okay, so that scenario sets the objective. Now, how do we actually achieve it? We need the tools, the methods. Let's talk about the integrability tactics.
Right. If the scenario is the goal, the tactics are how you get there. The overall aim of these tactics is pretty straightforward. You either want to reduce the number of dependencies you have to deal with, or you want to somehow reduce the expected distance between the components you're trying to integrate.
Makes sense. Fewer connections or smaller gaps to bridge. So what's the first group of tactics?
The first group is all about limit dependencies. And the absolute cornerstone tactic here is Encapsulate.
Encapsulation sounds fundamental.
It is. Think of it as putting a protective shell around your component. You define an explicit interface, and you force all interactions to go through that interface. No sneaking around to access internal details.
So it hides the complexity.
Yes, and by doing that, it dramatically cuts down the number of potential dependencies. Plus, it directly helps manage syntactic, data semantic, and behavioral semantic distances by controlling the point of interaction.
Okay, what else helps limit dependencies?
The next big one is to use an intermediary. This is about breaking direct connections. Instead of A talking directly to B, they both talk to something in the middle.
Like what kind of intermediary?
Common examples are things like publish-subscribe buses, message queues, or maybe a dedicated data transformer. Components don't need to know each other's specific identity or location. They just publish to the bus or send to the queue.
Ah, so it decouples them. The intermediary handles resolving some of the distance, like transforming data formats.
Exactly. It isolates components from each other. And the third tactic in this group is maybe the most obvious but powerful. Adhere to standards.
Just using established rules.
Pretty much. Whether it's industry standards like IE or ISO, or even just well-defined internal company conventions for APIs or data formats, standardization inherently reduces the potential variations, the distances you might encounter.
Which distances does standardization help with?
It can help across the board, really.
Mhm.
Syntactic distance, same function signatures, data semantic, agreed meanings for values, behavioral semantic, common protocols, even temporal distance sometimes, standard timing expectations.
Okay, so limiting dependencies through encapsulation, intermediaries, and standards. What's the next group of tactics?
Group 2 focuses on adapt, making components or the system flexible enough to cope with differences when they inevitably arise.
So not preventing dependencies, but making them easier to manage.
Sort of, yeah. The first tactic here is discover. This involves using some kind of discovery service like a catalog or a registry.
What does that do?
It allows components to find each other at runtime. Instead of being hardwired together at compile time, component A can ask the registry, hey, where's a service that does X?
Yeah.
And get back a current location or endpoint.
Ah, so it allows for late binding, more flexible.
Much more flexible. Reduces the need for explicit static dependencies. Then there's tailor interface.
Tailor interface. How's that different from encapsulation?
It's interesting. Tailor interface means adding or hiding capabilities of an existing interface without changing the component's actual API or its underlying implementation.
Wait, how do you do that?
Think of things like intercepting filters or using aspect-oriented programming. You can weave in code that intercepts calls, maybe validates data, translates formats on the fly, or adds security checks, all as the call passes through this tailoring layer. It's dynamic adaptation.
Okay, that's clever. Runtime adaptation. What else in the adapt group?
Configure behavior. This is about building components that are designed to be configurable from the outset. Maybe through configuration files, build flags, or even runtime parameters passed in requests. The idea is the component can adjust its behavior, its assumptions about data formats, protocols, timing to match a wider range of potential integration partners. It increases the chance that System S and a future component C will have compatible settings.
So making components adjustable to bridge distance preemptively?
Exactly. Planning for adaptability.
Okay, that covers limit dependencies and adapt. What's the third group?
The third group is coordinate. This is where you introduce more explicit control mechanisms to manage how components interact.
Centralized control.
Often, yes. The main tactic here is orchestrate. You use a central controller like a workflow engine or a business process management BPM system to manage the sequence of calls between components.
So the components themselves don't need to know about the overall workflow.
Right. Service A completes its task, tells the orchestrator, and the orchestrator then calls service BA, and B can remain completely unaware of each other. All the dependency logic is centralized in that orchestration layer.
What's the trade-off there?
Well, you simplify the components, but you concentrate complexity and create a potential single point of failure in the orchestrator. It centralizes the integration cost and risk.
Okay, and the last tactic.
The final tactic is manage resources. This is a specialized form of using an intermediary. You have a dedicated resource manager component.
What kind of resources?
Things like thread pools, database connections, maybe access to specific hardware. This manager governs access, enforces policies, and prevents conflicts. It directly tackles that resource distance we talked about by managing shared use and making resource needs explicit.
Got it. So orchestrate and manage resources for coordination. Now, How do these tactics actually manifest in common designs? This is where it gets really interesting, with architectural patterns.
Right. Architects don't usually just pick tactics off a list. They leverage established patterns that embody these principles.
Let's start with that Taylor interface tactic. You mentioned a trio of patterns related to it.
Yes, the tailoring trio: wrapper, bridge, and mediator. They all involve some form of translation or adaptation, but the key difference lies in when the translation rules are set and how autonomous the translating component is.
Okay, first up, wrapper. That sounds like it just wraps around a component.
Pretty much. It encapsulates a component, often becoming the only way other parts of the system interact with it. The wrapper's job is often to translate data or control signals. A classic example is wrapping a component that outputs data in imperial units to make it output metric units instead.
Simple translation layer. Okay, what about bridge?
A bridge also translates assumptions, typically between two specific components that weren't originally designed to work together. The key thing about a bridge is that the translation logic is usually fixed at construction time, like compile time or deployment time. It's often built for a specific, predefined translation need.
So wrapper hides one component, bridge connects two specific ones with fixed translation. How does mediator fit in? You said it's different.
It is crucially different. A mediator does translation like the others, but it incorporates a planning function. This means it can determine what translation is needed and how to do it at runtime.
Runtime planning. Based on what?
Based on the current system state, maybe policies, or perhaps discovering the capabilities of the components involved. Mediators are more autonomous, stateful, and persistent architectural elements. They handle complex, dynamic integration scenarios that a static wrapper or bridge can't.
Ah, okay. Runtime decision-making is the key for mediator. Interesting. What about broader architectural styles?
Well, service-oriented architecture, SOA, is a major one heavily influenced by integrability needs.
SOA. We hear that term a lot. How does the book define it?
As a collection of distributed components where each component provides or consumes services, the really key characteristics are heterogeneity and independence.
Heterogeneity meaning?
Components can be built on different platforms in different languages. And independence means they are often deployed separately and critically frequently managed by different organizations.
How does that differ from, say, microservices?
That's a good distinction. While microservices are also distributed components, they typically make up a single system, usually managed by one organization. SOA is often about integrating across organizational boundaries.
What's the cost of that cross-organization flexibility in SOA?
Overhead and complexity. You rely heavily on interoperability standards, things like WSDL for describing services, SOAP for messaging, to bridge the technological distances between these independent, heterogeneous services.
Makes sense. And one more pattern related to the tactics.
Yes, dynamic discovery, which directly implements the discover tactic we discussed earlier.
The runtime registry ID.
Exactly. This pattern allows service providers to register themselves and consumers to find them dynamically at runtime. This lets you do things like choose a service based on current load or cost or availability. Very flexible binding.
So wrapping things up, what does this all mean when you're designing a system?
I think the main takeaway is that integrability is fundamentally about risk management for future change. It forces you, as an architect, to look beyond just the functional requirements and APIs.
You have to actively identify and plan for bridging those 5 dimensions of distance, syntactic, semantic, behavioral, temporal, resource.
Right. And use tactics like encapsulation, intermediaries, configuration, orchestration, manifesting in patterns like wrappers, mediators, SOA, to consciously reduce the number of dependencies and minimize the distance at the ones that remain. It's proactive planning.
It really frames integrability as a specific kind of planning for modifiability, focused on connecting different pieces.
It does, which leads to a final, maybe provocative thought for you to consider, based on the book's own discussion prompts.
Okay, leave us with something to chew on.
We saw that many integrability tactics look a lot like general modifiability tactics. So the question is, if you build a system that is highly modifiable in general, does that automatically guarantee it will be easy to integrate into a completely different system or context later on? Or is there more to it?
Modifiability versus integrability in a new context. That is a good question. Context is always key in architecture, isn't it?
Always.
Well, that's definitely something to think about. Thank you for walking us through that. And thank you all for joining us for this deep dive into integrability.